I'm going to call to order this regular meeting of the Public Safety, Civil Rights, and Emergency Management Committee meeting today. Today is December 10th, 2014. I'm Councilmember Yang, Chair of this committee. With me are Councilmembers Palmisano, Gordon, and Council President Johnson. Councilmember Reich and Councilmember Warsame will be joining us shortly. Today, we have 6 items on our agenda. 4 items are consent items and 2 items are discussion items. And we will address the consent items first, but I will just read the agenda really quickly. The first item on consent is to authorize a 3-year contract with Dakota County Technical College in the amount not to exceed $250,500 for the first 3 years, with an option for 2 one-year extensions for emergency response pursuit training facility rental, and this will be referred to Ways and Means. Second item is to authorize a contract with SecuroNet in the amount of $22,298 for video camera surveillance network services within Minneapolis for 1 year, with costs shared by the Department of Public Works. Third item is to authorize a contract with the League of Minnesota Cities in the amount of $95,000 for access to their online law enforcement training for police officers, and it will be referred to Ways and Means, as well as the second item that I referred to. The fourth item is to authorize an annual plan agreement for 2015 with the Minnesota Department of Public Safety for the Police Department State Patrol, for the Police Department State Patrol to provide an instructor to coordinate training courses in SFST, DWI, SFT, goodness, and that will be referred to Ways and Means. The 2 discussion items, one is an overview presentation of the Police Chief's Citizen Advisory Council, and the 6th item and the second item on discussion is the Contract Compliance Division report, the 3rd quarter report. Council members, any questions? All right, well, we are just going to handle the consent items first, and with the consent items, any questions, council members, anyone want to pull anything off for discussion? All right, hearing none, I will move all 4 consent items for approval. All those in favor? Aye. Please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, the motion carries. And I don't see the police department here yet, and so we're gonna, yes.
Councilmember Yang, I apologize. Sherm Peterson was supposed to be here today to do the discussion item on the police department community engagement, and he unexpectedly got called out of town. So we're wondering if we could please defer it to the next meeting. And I apologize for the last minute, but it was last minute, so.
Okay, all right. Council members, any questions whatsoever? If not, I will just move that we defer this for 1 cycle, which would bring it into 2015.
Great, thank you very much.
Any questions whatsoever? All right, I'm going to ask the clerk, do we need a motion on that? Okay, I will move to postpone the item for another term. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, the motion carries.
Thank you.
All right, and our last discussion item is the Contract Compliance Division reporting, 3rd quarter report. And, Ms. Francois, you're here. Can you just give us highlights? I mean, we just want to know that it's done. And
sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Mr. Chair, council members, Council President Johnson, thank you for this opportunity to be here. And I also want to wish you all season's greetings. I'm really excited about this year. I'm getting ready to go to Mexico to be with my family. So season's greetings to all of you. I'm here, like you said, to present the 3rd quarter report. I will present highlights. The Contract Compliance Division, or CCD, monitors City of Minneapolis projects and contracts to ensure minority, women, and low-income business owners and workers have access to contracting and employment opportunities, and also to make sure that workers are paid appropriate wages. During the 3rd quarter, 6 construction projects totaling a little over $25 million closed. 2.87% of that, or $731,000, excuse me, went to minority business enterprises, and $1.2 million went to women business enterprises. Combining the first 3 quarters, the cumulative total for minority and women business inclusion to date is 20.64%, for a total so far of over $43 million going to minority and women businesses this year so far. 172,000 total workforce project hours were performed on closed projects through the end of the year, and 16.9% of those were performed by minority workers, and 3.49% were performed by female workers. Combining the first 3 quarters, 19.18% of the hours totally worked on projects to date were performed by minorities, and 5.4% excuse me, were performed by females. Sorry about that. CCD monitored minority and women business inclusion on 5 active projects that were valued at over $10 million each. It's important for us to note that minority and women business inclusion participation on active construction projects varies quite a bit depending on the phase of the project and when the minority or women business worked or when the minority or female workers worked on the project. At the time the data was pulled for this report, very little minority and women business participation had occurred on these projects, over $10 million. Of the total workforce project hours on active projects, valued over $10 million, minorities worked 17.24% of those hours, and females worked 3.99% of those hours. In a snapshot taken at the end of the quarter, the Contract Compliance Division staff was monitoring 175 projects at different stages of completion, valued at almost $700 million.
Council members, any questions? Council President Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Ms. Francois, is this report available online if we
Yes, it is.
Okay, I didn't see that on our agenda. I guess my question then is, obviously we had some really high goals for some of the more, what would you call it, high profile projects, including like the Viking Stadium. And I suppose it does, as you said, make a difference where the project is in the stages. But the numbers, just in just hearing you recite them, I have to look at them on paper, are a little bit disappointing. At 20%, kind of, I was hearing 19 and 20 and that sort of thing. But so what's your thought about that? Is it because some of the higher profile things aren't in the stages of being completed, or where are we at with those ones that we've had these specifically very high goals for?
Mr. Chair, Council President Johnson, actually the council had approved a 25% annual goal for construction projects, and we are at 20.64% for the year. So that's very good, actually. And with regard to the high profile projects, we set goals on every project based on availability, the disparity study, and the goals are not necessarily higher for one or the other. It's just a matter of determining what the scopes of work are on the projects and determining what minority and women-owned businesses are available in the directory to work on those projects, and also looking at what the disparity study availability says, and that's the way we set the goals. So we do that on every project exactly the same. But we're doing pretty good. At 20.64% for the year, I'd say that's very good. You're welcome.
Council members? Councilmember Gordon?
I just want a little reminder about reading some of the graphs. So when we say minority hours and then minority percent, the percent is a percent of the hours, not a percent of individuals.
Right, the percent of total hours.
And that's kind of what we peg our goals to, and everything is the percent of hours.
Yes.
Okay. And I guess my other question is, what if in some instances, some of those hours are much lower paid? Do we also look at the income side or the expense? So if you have a multi-million-dollar contract and maybe there's lots of hours that get filled with deconstruction or some of the unskilled labor, and typically often that's where we see more hours in terms of people of color were doing the work, but yet the other end where there might be designers or architects or legal help or people who are highly paid with highly technical labor skills, I get more revenue. So I'm just a little bit curious if we're also looking at actually the money difference as well as the hours.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Gordon, we are in the Contract Compliance Division not tracking that. We are aware of it, and we've been in conversations with the unions, also in conversation with the city's Minneapolis and Employment and Training Program, and I hope to have greater conversations with them next year about this, because we are aware of the fact that a lot of the specialty trades pay a lot more money. We'd like to see a lot more minorities and women doing that kind of work. And I believe that having these conversations with METP and their nonprofit providers around the region, around the city, will help us to identify those areas where we do need to have more minority and women participation.
Well, thanks. I just thought it was worth bringing up today. Appreciate that.
Council President Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Councilmember Gordon, I had a really interesting conversation with a constituent of mine who was a woman in the construction trades. We had lunch, and it was just fascinating, and kind of her experience of breaking into the trades. She was she just, looked at her life in her 40s and said, I'm not going anywhere and I want to do something different. And she went through Summit Academy's Women in the Trades program. And her experience of starting in the construction industry and where you do start out at sort of the bottom, the deconstruction, the general labor, that kind of thing, made me ask that, do we track how many hours are like by journeymen, how many hours are by skilled trades? And I do believe we do that. I think Ms. Corbel told me that in the budget that we do that. And that kind of gives you an indication of, where people are, and then the percentage of those people, their race, and that sort of thing in the different arenas in the construction industry. So, and what her point was that, and she's just giving her personal perspective, is that when you're in this general laborer category, that you kind of need to be aggressive to be able to say, I want to learn how to do this too. This is a little more complicated, and there's a lot of self-initiative that needs to happen to have people actually move then into more skilled work. And she saw that as kind of an area that people need to work on, the people that are interested, the foreman, that kind of thing, in broadening people's experience and having them be able to move into these areas, find out if they like carpentry or if they like plumbing, if they like the cement work, whatever it is, and guiding them in that way. Because otherwise, she said, you can kind of sit on a job and people will. And she talked about doing it for the numbers, that you're counted as a laborer, but you're not encouraged then into moving into more skilled work. And it's a challenge. So it was really an interesting conversation with her.
Councilmember Gordon.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And I think I do recall sometimes seeing on some of the charts skilled and unskilled. And so we've at least broken it into two. I think that might be useful information to have, especially because it could highlight this issue and maybe get people excited about or seeing the need to increase the training or recruitment or outreach for the skilled. And if we think there's something higher, a specialty training or whatever, I remember with having some discussions with people when the early stages of some of these projects where most of the money is going to architects and design specialists, and even if they wanted to, subcontract out, they were having trouble even subcontracting to a minority-owned architecture firm, for example. And so at least if we have that awareness, and as a city we can help show what we found out there, it could help people, help the market forces or individuals start to take some action on their own to correct it. So I appreciate you reminding us about that and that story. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? All right, seeing none. Ms. Francois, I just wanted to give you a heads up that, we are expecting these quarterly reports, and so I'm just gonna, for any of the future quarterly reports, I'm gonna add in about 60 days to it, and we'd like the Civil Rights Department to come and report on it. So, with regards to the fourth quarter, we'd like it sometime in early March, and just figure on getting it done by early March. Okay?
Very good.
All right, thank you. I will move to receive and file this third quarter report. Any discussion? Okay, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. And we have one last item that's a walk-on item that Councilmember Gordon wanted to bring on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I can pass this out too. I think I sent an email out about this. This is a staff direction. The Councilmember Yang and I have been working on, and this was actually something that originally we thought would come through the budget process, but we had some discussions with staff and with colleagues, and it seemed to make more sense to keep it in committee at this point. And this is something that Assistant Chief Clark and Attorney Susan Siegel has helped kind of craft the language on. It's something that we heard a lot about, and what I was finding that and heard about was actually there's lots of kind of requests for different pieces of this information, and it just made sense. Why don't we have this come together and come back to the committee? Well, the one point I wanted to make is we say report back to public safety at the first quarter of 2015 with this data, and my understanding is what we'll get is an update. I understand there Siegel tells me there's some 15,000 misdemeanor, offenses every year. So this isn't going to be just an easy project, but she is having an analyst join, and so they'll, who knows how soon they'll be getting hired to help do some of this work, but at least we can get a kind of an update on that, and hopefully we can have more information, and it will help us develop better policies.
Council President Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't object to collecting this data and looking at it and trying to understand what it means, but I am really concerned that we get into a dynamic of looking at data that then decisions are made about whether policing activities were excessive or a problem. And I'm just going to read a letter to the editor that one of my constituents wrote and was published yesterday. And he says, as a decade-long resident of North Minneapolis, a community very negatively affected by the fallout from disproportionate arrest rates for nonviolent drug and other offenses, I see a different side of the story. Someone had written about these disparities and what a problem it was. On one hand, drug and nonviolent felony convictions do follow the offenders for life with little or no benefit to society. On the other hand, now as someone who lives in North Minneapolis, I rarely go out in public in my community and do not see anybody openly using or selling marijuana, loitering, catcalling female pedestrians, soliciting everything from A to Z, and generally engaging in nuisance activity. This behavior discourages residents from supporting the local economy, discourages investment in the community, and generally makes for an undesirable living environment that people living in most suburbs do not see. The letter writer he was responding to was from Edina. Often when reports on arrest and sentencing disparities are published, the conversation entirely neglects to address the behavior that pervades some communities and that drives the increased police patrols and enforcement. The reality is that we need the arrests for these nuisance crimes in order to maintain any civility. The solution to address the disparities is often not to enforce nuisance crimes. This exacerbates the issues some communities face. Perhaps the conversation needs to encompass the disparities in community standards and behavior in order to more effectively address the issue. I completely agree with him, and I also want to just read a part of the Star Tribune's editorial yesterday, actually, about our budget, and it talked about excessive use of force. Some protesters have called for cutting the police department and directing the resources to more neighborhood community programs. But it also says, community comments from a recent series of meetings with the mayor and police chief show that cutting public safety isn't the way to go. While residents shared concerns about police misconduct, they also expressed the need for better police response times in higher crime neighborhoods. They want bad officers to be disciplined or fired, but they also want good officers to help improve safety in their communities. And so I think that when we look at one side of the equation in isolation, without the input of the people who are making the 911 calls, who are reporting the behavior that results in stops and sometimes arrests, we neglect to look at the whole side of the issue. So I hope that when we get this information, we look at the context and we look at what people are trying to accomplish in their community and live in a safe environment. It's really frustrating. You know, I have constituents go to work every day and they are awakened at 2 o'clock in the morning with shots fired in their alley. I mean, there are different circumstances across the city, and I think that sometimes we don't realize some of the circumstances that people are living in, and you know, people have choices about where they live, and if we decide that we're not going to enforce, you know, people urinating in public or whatever the problems are that we identify being disproportionate in arrests or stops, we're going to create parts of our city that are unlivable.
Council members, any other comments? Councilmember Gordon?
Well, I just want to say that I agree wholeheartedly, and I recognize this is part of a much larger and more complicated discussion, and I also understand that the police and the city attorneys are actually exploring grants or other possibilities, working with Cura and others to make sure that we get the complete picture. And there's examples in my neighborhood where there was actually a homeless person who froze to death not too long ago. And if there had been a patrol and somebody had found her being a vagrant or some, you know, there would have been a way to interact and get some help. So I appreciate that a lot of times it's a lot more complex and we have to dig in a lot more deeply than seems like. So I think it's important that every time we bring this up and every time we try to look at some pieces of our puzzles, we also make sure that we're aware of all the other ones. And often I recognize that some of the differences we might find in geographic area. I mean, we should just expect if it's a hot spot, there's going to be more activity in a hot spot, for example, and everybody needs to recognize that, and we need to tell everybody that. And so this will just be one piece, but it's important that we always remember that there's the big picture that we have to keep coming back to. And I think this will help us walk down that path a little bit better and a little better informed. And I think that the clerk's suggesting that we read the staff direction since it's on record. Would you like to?
Yeah, I could read it,
okay.
or you could read it.
You go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'm going to read the motion first, and then I'm going to put a few comments in, and we'll see if there are any other comments after that. The motion in its entirety is a motion by Councilmember Gordon and Yang. It's directing the police department and the city attorney's office to provide data on misdemeanor arrest, charging, prosecution, and diversion by race, gender, age, geography, and offense for the years 2010 to 2014, to report back to the Public Safety, Civil Rights, and Emergency Management Committee in the first quarter of 2015. and further directing the attorney's office, the city attorney's office, and the police department to make recommendations concerning the development of a policy and potential protocol for the recording and reporting of demographic information, especially race and location of police stops that do not necessarily lead to an arrest, and to report back with recommendations regarding the second quarter of 2015. And council members, I just want to say, I mean, I urge you to support this. I think that if anything, you know, this is going to help with public trust as we move forward with police relations with the community. And I think, I mean, that's kind of a really large statement to make, but I want to echo what Council President Johnson had to say with regards to the folks up in North Minneapolis. I represent the lower half of North Minneapolis, and you know, I've been one of the proponents of more police. I just have said that consistently, and that's just the thing is that, you know, for a place like North Minneapolis where we see crimes or violent crimes more than other places, you know, that's the one thing that we can be reassured of is to have more cops, to make our lives a little bit easier and to make our lives a little bit safer. And, you know, that's the price that I'm willing to pay, you know, as a council member for the safety of the people that I represent, because most of the times when I think about the folks who I represent, you know, it's just for them, I mean, it's really about just not having to worry about any of the stray bullets that might fly out or anything like that that just are, you know, not just inconveniences, but I mean, just life-altering events that might happen. And so, you know, I think the other thing that, you know, has to be recognized here is that, you know, I represent a ward that is upwards of 70+% people of color, and I would say Council President Johnson represents a ward that is, you know, a majority minority district as well. And so, in that regard, I mean, I think both of us are fairly sensitive to the issue of racial profiling and how that might impact folks. But you know, at some point, I mean, we do need to collect better data just to, you know, if anything, I mean, prove to the public that there is a concerted effort on our part to make the city better for everybody, not just white people, but everybody in general. And so I think with something like this, I mean, it's a step forward, and I would encourage all of you to support this. Councilmember Reich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and if I could appeal to the authors. It seems to me that it would be, just as a matter of form, not speaking to the merit or the intent, to have one unified report and have that be at the second quarter. It's not clear to me that this has been vetted with the people who actually have to do this work, and so perhaps for the first quarter request, that'll give them a little more room to complete it. But I would very much like to do the data at one report at one time as a comprehensive display of data. So that maybe it'd be a friendly amendment to make both reports due at the second quarter at the same time. That would be my humble request.
Councilmember Gordon.
I'm open to considering that, but I think the difference between the two sections is we don't have any data for the second one, and all we're asking is this something we think we should put some time and attention into collecting, and if so, how? And, I mean, we may have some, but if there's not a police report and there's other things. So the second one is just kind of getting at, should we actually care enough and under what conditions to kind of track just this is just the stop and talks and those kinds of things that happen. And I don't think we want any beat officer to necessarily be recording every time they talk to a business person or a kid or they're doing outreach. I mean, maybe the policy would come back with some easy way to do that, but that's how there's a big distinction. The items in the first one, there's data that's already being collected and that we already have. But I'm also, if we'd like to put them both in the second quarter, it's not that big of a, I mean, I'm willing to do that just to defer to the wishes of my colleague in the committee. But I would have to check with the co-author of the motion.
Councilmember Reich, would you like to move forward your friendly amendment?
I would suggest that a friendly amendment.
Okay, and I can accept that as a friendly amendment. Councilmember Gordon? Okay, I see you're nodding as well. So we will just fix this amendment to require reporting in the second quarter, at the end of the second quarter. So I'd imagine probably sometime around June, July. Okay. And with that, I will move this motion forward. Any other discussion? All right, hearing none. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. And seeing that there's no further business before this committee, we are adjourned. Thank you.
It's in my brain.